The morning sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, painting streaks of gold on the kitchen counter. The smell of fresh coffee hung in the air, blending with the faint aroma of toasted bread. The scene was perfect, a snapshot of domestic life. But as I poured the coffee into his mug, the emptiness gnawed at me. My husband sat at the table, his laptop open, eyes scanning the news. He would nod occasionally as I spoke, offering automatic responses that felt more like punctuation marks than conversation. This wasn't a bad life, I reminded myself. We had built something steady, stable. And yet that stability felt more like a cage some mornings. I longed for something more, though I wasn't sure what that more was. I wanted to be seen not as a figure moving through the kitchen or as part of the scenery, but as someone vibrant, desired. The phone buzzed, breaking the quiet. My husband picked it up, his face lighting up as he answered. It was his friend. An invitation to a Sunday barbecue. Of course we'll be there, he said without even asking me. His confidence in our routines was unwavering, almost comforting. Almost. Later that afternoon we arrived at their house, a warm two-story home with flower beds lining the walkway. The backyard was already bustling with laughter, the scent of grilled meat thick in the air. Friends mingled with cold beers in hand, their faces flushed with the afternoon sun. As we stepped into the backyard, my husband greeted everyone with his usual charm, blending into the group effortlessly. And that's when I saw him. He arrived a few minutes later, carrying a pack of beer over his shoulder with an easy grin that seemed to disarm everyone around him. My husband's face lit up as he spotted him. Hey, you made it, he said, walking over to clasp his hand. He turned to me, his voice playful. This is my wife. I extended my hand politely, expecting the usual pleasantries. But when he took my hand, our eyes met, just for a second longer than necessary. His grip was firm, warm, steady. A flicker of something passed between us, like the slow crackle of a fire waiting for a spark. The afternoon passed in a blur of conversations and laughter, yet my awareness of him sharpened with every passing minute. He was standing a few feet away, chatting with someone else, but it was as if a current ran between us. The sound of his voice, low and unhurried, cut through the background noise and settled somewhere deep inside me. At some point I wandered toward the grill, offering to help with the coals, an excuse to busy my hands and escape the growing tension in my chest. And then he was there, stepping up beside me with an amused smile. Need a hand? He asked, reaching for the metal tongs. Our fingers brushed as I took them, a fleeting touch, yet it sent a shiver down my spine. The heat from the grill was nothing compared to the warmth radiating from that brief contact. Thanks, I murmured, though my voice felt smaller, almost fragile. He didn't reply immediately, just stood there for a second longer than necessary, the hint of a smile on his lips. You've got it, he finally said, stepping back, but not before our eyes met again. A quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of something neither of us dared name. I returned to the table, trying to focus on the conversations around me, but my thoughts kept circling back to those moments. It wasn't just the touch. It was the way the air shifted when he was near, the way my senses seemed to tune only to him. By the time we left the barbecue, the sky had softened into a pale orange. My husband talked about the jokes his friends made and the plans for the next weekend, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I leaned my head against the car window, watching the streets of Chicago roll by. The buildings blurred together as if the city itself was whispering secrets I couldn't yet understand. That night, as we lay in bed, my husband drifted into sleep almost instantly. I lay there in the quiet, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. Yet all I could hear was the echo of his voice near the grill and the memory of that single touch. The morning air was crisp as I stepped out for a walk along the lakeshore, hoping that the familiar hum of Chicago's life would quiet the noise in my mind. The breeze from Lake Michigan brushed against my skin, but no matter how far I walked, I couldn't shake the memory of yesterday. That moment by the grill replayed itself like an old reel. His hand grazing mine, the faint smirk that lingered on his face. I should have felt guilty. I should have let the moment die quietly, like the final ember of a dying flame. But instead it flickered into something I couldn't control. A stubborn, persistent spark. By mid-morning I returned home to find my husband glued to his laptop, immersed in another project. I moved past him, murmuring something about needing fresh air, but I doubt he even heard me. He offered a vague nod, his fingers tapping furiously at the keyboard. Minutes later, I found myself walking toward the cafe near the Loop, a quaint spot tucked between office buildings, where the aroma of roasted beans drifted out into the street. It was a place I rarely visited, but something drew me there that day as if fate itself was conspiring. The doorbell timed as I stepped inside. And there he was. He was seated at a corner table reading something on his phone, his coffee untouched. When he looked up and saw me, surprise flashed across his face, quickly replaced by something softer. "Hey," he said, standing up slightly. "This feels fated." I laughed. A nervous short laugh. "Or maybe Chicago isn't as big as we like to think. Or maybe," he said, tilting his head, "you just wanted good coffee." He gestured to the seat across from him, and for a second I hesitated. Sitting down felt like stepping over a line I wasn't sure I could retreat from. But I sat anyway, my pulse quickening. We made small talk at first. Discussions about mundane things. The weather, the traffic downtown, the best hidden spots in the city. Yet beneath each word was a current of something unspoken. "You seem different today," he said suddenly, his gaze steady, unguarded. "Different?" He leaned forward slightly. "Like you're somewhere else." I met his eyes, unsure of how much I wanted to admit. "Maybe I am," I said softly. The pause between us stretched, filled with the weight of everything we weren't saying. And then, almost imperceptibly, he reached across the table, his fingers brushing mine. Not by accident this time. It was the simplest touch, yet my breath caught in my throat. "I don't want to make this complicated," he murmured, as though trying to convince both of us. "Neither do I whispered. But neither of us moved. The cafe, the world, everything faded into the background as I became aware only of the space between us. Too small, too charged. And then, without thinking, I leaned in. Our lips met in a brief, hesitant kiss, like the first drop of rain on dry earth. It was soft, fleeting, but it set every nerve in my body on edge. For a heartbeat, everything felt quiet, weightless. I pulled back, my heart hammering in my chest. His gaze searched mine, not for answers but for some reassurance that I felt it too. I started, but the words wouldn't come. His expression softened. "It's okay," he said gently. "We don't have to figure it out today." I nodded, suddenly overwhelmed. I stood up, barely able to process what had just happened. "I should go." He didn't try to stop me. "Take care of yourself," he said, his voice low. I walked out of the cafe into the cold air, but I barely felt it. The kiss lingered, on my lips, in my mind. I knew I had crossed a line, but instead of fear or regret, there was only a deep, unrelenting ache for something I hadn't realized I was missing until that moment. The truth was simple yet devastating. I wanted more. The hours after the kiss felt like a haze, each second heavier than the last. I had spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself. Cleaning, running errands, scrolling aimlessly through my phone. But everything felt distant. My mind kept drifting back to that moment, the way his touch had shattered something inside me and pieced me back together at the same time. By evening, my husband was home, absent-mindedly flipping through TV channels. He asked about my day without looking up. I mumbled something vague in return. I knew he didn't notice the slight tremble in my voice or how tightly I clutched my glass of water. The first message came late that night. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling while the city outside pulsed with life. The faint buzz of my phone on the nightstand made me flinch. I reached for it, my pulse spiking when I saw his name on the screen. "Him, I can't stop thinking about it." I stared at the words, my heart beating in my ears. My thumb hovered over the keyboard as my mind raced with questions. What was I supposed to say? Deny it? Pretend it hadn't happened? But I was done pretending. Me neither can I. The response felt like a confession, typed in the dark like a secret carved into stone. Almost immediately, the typing bubble appeared on the screen. Do you regret it?" My chest tightened. Did I regret it? The logical answer should have been yes. But that wasn't the truth. There was a long pause before his next message appeared. "Can I see you? Just a talk." I swallowed hard. He wasn't asking for anything more. Just words. Just clarity. But we both knew it wasn't that simple. I stared at the screen, torn between what I knew was right and what I desperately wanted. "Me, tomorrow. By the lake." As soon as I hit send, my nerves lit up. This wasn't a simple conversation. It was the beginning of something that felt inevitable. The next evening, I walked toward the lakeshore as the sky melted into shades of pink and gold. Chicago's skyline loomed behind me like a witness to everything I was about to confess. The air was cold, biting at my skin, but I barely noticed. I spotted him before he saw me, his silhouette leaning against the railing, looking out over the water. When he turned and saw me, his face softened. I felt it again, that pull, that quiet hum in the air between us. "You came," he said, as though he hadn't expected me to. "I told you I would," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. We stood there for a few seconds, the silence between us heavier than the city noise around us. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted finally, folding my arms against the cold. "I shouldn't be here." He nodded slowly, stepping closer. "I know. But I'm glad you are." His honesty was disarming. He didn't try to dress it up or make it sound easier than it was. "I don't want to ruin anything," I whispered. "Not my life. Not yours." He exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air. "Me neither." He looked at me, his eyes steady and clear. "But sometimes, it feels like life doesn't care about the rules we make for ourselves." Those words undid me. I leaned against the railing, my grip tightening on the cold metal. "How did this happen?" I asked, though I wasn't really looking for an answer. He laughed quietly, a soft, rueful sound. "Isn't it obvious? You're incredible. And I don't think you've realized it for a long time." My breath hitched in my throat. No one had said that to me in years. Not like that, with such conviction. The vulnerability in his voice mirrored my own. He reached for my hand, this time without hesitation. His fingers were warm despite the cold. I didn't pull away. Instead, I looked down at our hands. Two simple gestures entwined in a web of complexity and danger. "I don't know what this is," I said softly. "But I can't pretend it doesn't exist." He nodded, his thumb brushing gently over my knuckles. "Then don't." The sky dimmed into twilight as the city's lights began to shimmer along the horizon. I knew I couldn't stay much longer. Someone would notice if I was gone for too long. "I have to go," I murmured, hating how much I meant it. He didn't try to stop me. Instead, he let go of my hand slowly, as if committing the feeling of it to memory. "Tomorrow?" he asked, his voice quiet but certain. I hesitated for the briefest of moments before I nodded. "Tomorrow." As I walked away, the sound of the water lapping against the shore faded into the distance. But the warmth of his hand lingered, burning in my memory like a secret I was no longer sure I could hide. The next morning, the city was buzzing with its usual chaos. Horns blared, pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, and the hum of daily life filled the air. But I moved through it all like a ghost, detached, floating somewhere between the life I knew and the life I was beginning to crave. The weight of my choices pressed down on me like the gray Chicago sky. By the time I arrived home, my husband was already packing a duffel bag. His face lit up when he saw me, though it was the familiar, fleeting excitement of someone caught up in logistics rather than emotion. "Great news," he said, zipping up the bag. "We've been invited to spend the weekend at Mark and Emily's place up in Lake Geneva. You remember how you loved their cabin, right?" I forced a nod, though my stomach tightened into knots. Lake Geneva was meant to be an escape, a serene place where the city's noise couldn't follow. But now the idea of being trapped there, pretending everything was fine while my mind screamed with indecision, felt suffocating. "When do we leave?" I asked, masking my unease. "In a few hours. We can beat traffic if we leave by 3. I nodded again and turned toward the bedroom. Every step felt heavy, as though the gravity of what I was about to face was pulling me down. A few hours later, we were on the road. The city skyline disappeared behind us as we drove north. My husband hummed along to the radio, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I stared out the window, watching the trees blur into a mosaic of green and brown. Somewhere along the drive, my phone buzzed in my lap. I glanced down, my heart racing when I saw his name. "Him, Lake Geneva? Are you serious?" "He didn't tell me." "Me, I didn't know until this morning." There was a pause before his next message appeared. "Him, I'm going too. Mark asked me last night." My breath caught. I could feel the blood rush to my ears. The weekend wasn't just going to be a quiet escape. It was about to become a minefield. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it. Rustic yet elegant, with wide windows that framed the lake like a painting. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a reminder that we had left the noise of the city far behind. Mark and Emily greeted us at the door, their smiles wide and welcoming. The others were already inside, laughing and unpacking. My husband dropped our bags and immediately joined the conversation, blending into the crowd as he always did. And then he walked in. He was carrying a cooler, his face slightly flushed from the cool air outside. Our eyes met briefly across the room, a silent, electric recognition. He smiled, that easy, familiar grin that I was beginning to know too well. The weekend had barely begun and already the air felt too thick to breathe. Dinner that night was loud and warm, the kind of evening filled with inside jokes and wine glasses clinking together. I tried to laugh, to blend in, but every glance across the table felt like a tether pulling me toward him. I was painfully aware of where he sat, of the way his fingers curled around the stem of his glass, of how his laughter seemed to fill the room in ways I couldn't ignore. At one point our eyes met again. This time neither of us looked away. My heart pounded in my chest as he gave the faintest shake of his head, almost imperceptible to anyone but me. It was a message, a warning maybe, or a plea. After dinner, people began to drift outside toward the fire pit. I could see the glow of the flames through the window, hear the crackle of the logs as they caught fire. I stepped out onto the back porch, needing air. The night was cool, the sky clear and dotted with stars. I heard the door open behind me and felt him step outside. He didn't speak right away and neither did I. We just stood there, listening to the soft murmur of conversation from the others. "You okay?" he asked quietly after a moment. I nodded, though it was a lie. He leaned against the railing, his shoulder just inches from mine. "This weekend's going to be complicated." I laughed, though it sounded more like a sigh. "That's an understatement." We stood in silence again, the space between us humming with everything unsaid. "You should go back inside," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. He exhaled slowly. "I will. Just, not yet." And for a moment the weight of the world didn't matter. We were just two people standing under a sky full of stars, caught between what was right and what felt inevitable. The fire crackled in the distance, sending faint embers into the cool night air. Laughter and soft conversations echoed from the fire pit where the others sat. But out here on the back porch, everything felt still, suspended in some fragile private world where only the two of us existed. I kept my eyes on the dark outline of the lake, watching the way the moonlight shimmered across the surface. But I felt him there, closer than he'd ever been, even in the cafe, even in that fleeting kiss. He wasn't touching me, but his presence pressed against me like gravity, impossible to ignore, pulling me in. "You don't have to stay," I whispered. "I know," he said softly. But he didn't move. For a few moments, we just listened to the sounds of the night, the gentle rustle of the trees, the distant hum of insects, the soft clinking of wine glasses. He leaned forward, his forearms resting against the porch railing, his head slightly bowed as though he was fighting something within himself. "I thought I'd be better at this," he said finally, his voice raw in the quiet. "Better at what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. He turned to look at me then, and the vulnerability in his eyes made my heart clench. "At pretending I don't feel anything when you're near." I didn't know what to say. His words hit me like a tidal wave, and for a moment I felt like I was drowning in them. My hands tightened on the railing until my knuckles turned white. I could feel my resolve crumbling, piece by piece. "You think I'm good at pretending?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Because I'm not." He exhaled sharply, as though my words had cut through some invisible thread. In one swift motion he turned toward me, his hand brushing against mine on the railing. This time neither of us pulled away. The stars seemed impossibly bright above us, a quiet witness to what was unfolding. "I tried to stay away," he said, his fingers finally closing around mine. His touch was warm, steady, like an anchor in the chaos. "I really tried." My throat felt tight, my pulse thundering in my ears. "So did I admitted. And then there was no space left between us." His hand cupped the side of my face, hesitant at first, as though waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I leaned into his touch, and it felt like I'd been holding my breath for weeks, maybe months, and was finally allowed to exhale. When his lips met mine, it wasn't tentative like the first time. It was slow, deliberate, like he'd been waiting for this moment as long as I had. The warmth of his mouth, the way his hand slid gently along my cheek, it was all-consuming and tender, and yet it felt like standing on the edge of something dangerous. The world fell away, reduced to the quiet thrum of our heartbeats. For those few stolen moments, I forgot where we were, who might see us, or what it could cost. All I knew was that I didn't want it to end. But it had to. I pulled away first, breathless and shaken. He let his hand fall slowly, reluctantly, as though letting go of something fragile. "We can't do this," I said, though the words felt hollow. "I know," he whispered, his voice rough with unspoken emotion. "But that doesn't change how I feel." I swallowed hard, blinking back the sting of tears. I wasn't sure if they came from guilt or something else entirely. "This isn't a solution," I said. "It's just making everything harder." He nodded, stepping back to put some distance between us, though it looked like it physically hurt him to do so. "Then maybe I should go inside." I nodded, unable to speak. He hesitated for a moment longer, his eyes locked on mine as though he wanted to memorize everything about this moment. Then he turned and walked back inside, the door closing softly behind him. I stayed there on the porch, staring out at the lake, my fingers still tingling where his touch had been. The night air felt colder without him, the stars above almost too bright, too silent. The laughter from the fire pit continued, oblivious to what had just happened in the shadows. But inside me, something irrevocable had shifted. I knew there was no going back, not after this. The annual fall fair was in full swing when we arrived. The air was thick with the sweet scent of caramel popcorn and the faint tang of metal from the old rides. Strings of carnival lights zigzagged across the sky, casting everything in a warm, golden glow. The laughter of children and the hum of mechanical rides filled the air. It felt surreal, almost too bright, too loud after the quiet turmoil of the night before. We had all decided to come as a group, pretending everything was normal. Mark and Emily led the way, their hands intertwined like they hadn't a care in the world. I stayed close to my husband, who was busy chatting with one of the others, unaware of how restless I felt inside. He was happy here in this noise, this chaos. But for me it all felt like a thin veneer over something far more fragile. And then I saw the mechanical bull. It sat in the center of the fairground, a ridiculous contraption surrounded by hay bales and cheering spectators. The padded mat around it was littered with fallen challengers, most of whom staggered away laughing. A wiry teenage boy in a fairground uniform stood next to the control panel, encouraging the crowd to step up. I wasn't sure why I moved closer. Maybe I wanted a distraction. Maybe I just wanted to feel something sharp and immediate, something that could drown out everything else. The teenager grinned at me, raising an eyebrow. "You want to give it a shot?" I hesitated. This wasn't my kind of thing. I wasn't impulsive, wasn't the type to make a spectacle of myself. But something inside me whispered, "Do it." I stepped forward. "Why not?" I said, more to myself than to anyone else. The boy handed me a helmet and gestured toward the bull. The crowd hooped and clapped as I climbed on, gripping the handlebar tightly. The bull's surface was rough beneath my fingers, and the absurdity of the moment made me want to laugh. The boy's voice rang out, "Ready?" I nodded. The bull jerked to life beneath me, tilting to one side before spinning sharply. I clenched my teeth, my body tensing as I tried to stay balanced. My thighs pressed against the saddle, my arms straining to keep my hold steady. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't let go. He made me swallow it to the end, I thought, willing myself to focus, to push through the burn in my muscles. The bull spun faster, its jerky movements demanding every ounce of strength I had. The cheers of the crowd became distant as I locked my focus on staying upright. My vision narrowed, my senses reduced to the feeling of the bull beneath me and the dull roar of my own breath. Then the bull lurched violently and I was thrown off, tumbling onto the padded mat. The impact knocked the wind out of me, but I wasn't hurt. The boy flashed me a thumbs up from the control panel, an unspoken challenge in his grin. "Wanna go again?" he called. I pushed myself up onto my knees, brushing stray pieces of hay from my jeans. The adrenaline buzzed through my veins. I was already sweating, my pulse erratic. But something about the way he asked, so casual, so easy, made me nod. I climbed back onto the bull, gripping the handle even tighter this time. He made me get on my knees and do it harder and harder, I thought, determined not to let the damn machine beat me. The boy smirked as he turned the dial up a notch. The bull spun again, but this time I was ready. My body moved instinctively with its twists and jolts, muscles tightening and releasing with each turn. I was no longer just holding on, I was riding. The crowd cheered louder when they saw me stay on longer than most. I could hear the applause, the shouts of surprise when I didn't fall. My grip held strong even as the bull thrashed beneath me like a storm. When I finally let go and slid off the side, the crowd erupted into applause. I stood there, panting but victorious. My husband waved at me from the sidelines, a proud grin on his face. But my eyes darted instinctively to him, the one person whose reaction I couldn't ignore. He was standing near the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable. But I caught the subtle shift in his stance, the way his arms crossed over his chest, almost as if he was restraining himself. And then, barely noticeable, he nodded just once, his lips curving into the faintest smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a thrill through me that the ride couldn't match. I smiled back, savoring the victory, not just over the bull, but over the doubt that had clung to me like a shadow. For that brief moment I felt powerful. Strong. Taken. But deep down I knew that nothing had been resolved. The ride had ended, but the real challenge was still waiting for me. The fairground buzzed around me, the energy of the crowd mixing with the fading sounds of carnival music and laughter. But inside everything felt quiet. The victory over the mechanical bull seemed distant now, as though it belonged to someone else. It wasn't just the ride, it was everything. I watched my husband, his back turned as he chatted with Emily and Mark. He looked so at ease, so effortless in his social interactions, and I wondered if he even noticed how much I had changed, how much I was slipping away from him. I tried to shake it off, to pretend it didn't matter. I had won. I had stayed on the bull longer than anyone else, proven something to myself. But no matter how much I told myself that, the feeling of his eyes on me, the way he'd looked at me earlier when I got off the bull, kept repeating itself in my mind over and over again. Why do I need this? I thought. Why do I need to be seen by him? I wandered toward the food stalls, my mind racing with thoughts I didn't know how to process. I needed space to breathe, to escape the walls that were closing in. As I passed the cotton candy booth, the smell of sugar lingered in the air, but it couldn't distract me. Suddenly, a voice broke through my thoughts. Didn't think you'd be so good at that. I froze. His voice was too close, too familiar. He was standing right next to me, just outside the line of the food stands, watching me with that same intense gaze. Were you watching me? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. I never take my eyes off you, he said, his words so simple but charged with meaning. My breath caught in my throat. The casualness of his tone, the way his words hung between us, seemed to unravel something deep inside me. I couldn't look away from him. I began, but I stopped, not sure what I was about to say. It's not what you think, I finished lamely. He smiled, though it was soft, almost sad. Is it not? I didn't know how to answer. The words felt stuck in my throat, caught between what I wanted to say and what I knew I couldn't. I'm not your escape, he said gently, his voice lowering. I'm not the solution. I nodded, even though his words felt like a slap. I didn't want to hear them, but I couldn't pretend they weren't true. We were both standing on a precipice, and neither of us was willing to step back. Then what are we doing? I whispered, barely able to find the courage to speak the truth aloud. He stepped closer, closing the gap between us. I could feel the heat from his body, his presence overwhelming me in the cool evening air. I don't know, he admitted. But I'm not walking away, not without knowing how you really feel. I swallowed hard, the words thick on my tongue. You don't know what this is doing to me, I said, my voice barely audible. It's tearing me apart. He didn't respond right away. He simply reached out and took my hand, his fingers warm against mine. I didn't pull away. Felt too natural, too right. His touch was like an anchor in the chaos of everything we were ignoring, everything we were pretending wasn't happening. We don't have to figure this out now, he said, his voice gentle. But you have to make a choice. I can't keep waiting for you to decide. I closed my eyes, my heart racing. I knew what he was saying and I knew what it meant. The weight of it hung over us, a silent ultimatum I didn't want to acknowledge. But as I stood there, my fingers interlaced with his, the world around us seemed to blur out of focus. The only thing I could hear, the only thing that mattered, was the sound of my heartbeat and the feeling of his hand in mine. You're not the only one who's been waiting, I whispered, my voice raw. I don't know what to do either. He didn't speak, but his grip tightened, as though he was silently acknowledging everything we hadn't said. And for a moment, just a fleeting moment, it felt like everything could be different. The fairground, the people, the past, it all seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us standing at the edge of something neither of us could fully grasp. But reality came crashing back quickly. My husband's voice calling for me from across the field shattered the moment. I let go of his hand, the warmth of it leaving me suddenly cold. I turned toward the sound of his voice, forcing a smile onto my face as I rejoined the group. But in my heart I knew nothing would ever be the same again.